Hello, this is Rocky Marciano. When I was heavyweight champion of the world, they called me the Brockton Blockbuster. You find out why.
Welcome to the Rocky Marciano Archives, a channel dedicated to the life and career of the immortal champion. Now sit back, relax for a moment as you listen to researcher and archivist John Cameron read from his own project, transporting you back to 1948. This chapter from Redemption, The Life of Rocky Marciano, Volume 1, 1923 through 1949, delves into the future, Champion's early forays into New York as he prepares to embark on his professional career. We uncover his association with the former William Sloane House, pass through Stillman's gym, plus feature a cameo from the legendary Angelo Dundee. We hope you get something out of this.
That place was like something out of a movie. Everywhere you looked, there was something going on. People thought I was crazy for living there, but I liked it just fine. Rocky Marciano. Now that Marciano had finally found himself under the official guidance of manager Al Weil, events began to change drastically for the former labourer. Already Weil had attempted to take his family name from the fighter. Now he would attempt to remove the family influence altogether. As Almeida recorded of his sometime associate, he, Weil, hated anybody from distracting his boys, family, girlfriends, anyone without his consent. He would vet everyone in that boy's life, and if he felt they were wrong for his fighter, he would do his damnedest to cut them out completely. To this end, Al informed his new acquisition that before he fought again, he would have to serve an apprenticeship under the watchful eye of Charlie Goldman. And not from the distance of Brockton. No, not this time. Weil wanted him close. He told Marciano that from now on he would be spending more time in New York, away from distraction, away from his family. However, Al Weil may have been shrewd in business, but as a reader of characters, he was way off. At least when it came to Rocky Marciano. Family, la famiglia, was everything to Marciano, as it was for all Italian children from time immemorial. Indeed, the family unit was so strong that as the offspring grew and moved out, they would not stray far. Their connections were binding. Being part of this unit meant that you were protected, cared for, loved, and the biggest part of any family was the mother. Yes, Rocky was intensely loyal to his mother. He was reticent of being removed for too long from his own indomitable family. For now, though, the Brockton boy, keen to advance himself, had no option but to acquiesce to his manager's demand. Thus he returned to his hometown briefly to break the news of his departure. Weil wanted him to stay in New York for at least a month that would be spent fine-tuning the already monumental changes that had been made by Goldman. Pasqualina, by all accounts, pleaded with her son not to go. She had lost so much time with him during his years in the service of his country, yet Rocky knew he had little choice. This was his last chance to make something of his life. Besides, it would only be for a short while. He would be back. Little did Marciano know at the time that this would be the start of his wanderings, the start of a life which would keep him separated from his family for months at a time. The beginning for him on his road to success would lead inevitably to a decline in his private life that would never truly be reversed. Still, at least he would have Ali with him, Ali who acted as a sort of umbilical back to his hometown, back to his roots. Wherever Rocky went, he could look at Ali and remember where he had come from, just as he looked forward to where he was headed now. Often it was a great comfort to him to recall the warmth of his past, yet at others it remained a burden, recalling the hardships both he and his family had gone through, swearing he would never go through that again. He would bleed without protest and ache without complaint if he could be called champion, wrote journalist Jimmy Cannon. Obscurity was all he feared. The pairing of Marciano and Colombo headed out for their prolonged sojourn in New York in the same manner that they had first arrived some 4 months previously. In the cab of the uncomfortable, dilapidated, constantly rattling truck driven by Bill O'Malley. Their destination this time was not the dazzling, vibrant belly of Broadway, but rather the austerely comfortable rooming house of Ma Braun, and into the waiting arms of Charlie Goldman. Work with Charlie began almost immediately at the CYO, with the astute Goldman piecing together this chunk of proverbial rock. However, he moved with caution now. Marciano was coming along just right. He was winning. That was crucial to Charlie. The trainer was brutally aware of the shortcomings that this wild fighter still possessed, but was reticent to tinker with his basic style. "I'm not going to fool with him too much," Goldman was quoted by the late Everett M. Skean. When a fighter's winning big, a trainer's got to be careful he doesn't do nothing to foul him up. One morning, Goldman arrived at the CYO with a young 27-year-old who had imbued himself in boxing and was eager to make a name for himself as a trainer. His name was Angelo Dundee. The future elder statesman recalled his initial meeting with Marciano. "I was the new kid around the block in New York, and Charlie would bring me to family-type restaurants on 9th Avenue. He told me about this kid from Brockton he was training at the CYO. Shortish, stooping shoulders, 2 left feet, but oh, how he can punch. Charlie took me to the CYO with him, and Rocky walked in with a small canvas bag. He worked with Keen Simmons that day. Charlie was having him do an exercise where he bent his knees completely down, almost touching the floor with his butt, and then came up punching. And this boxer called Rocky would do it and end up with a left hook or a right hand every time." He continued to recall the man who would become a close friend. "That great desire to win was so evident in the guy. I could see it right from the beginning, and I could see the progress. Rocky came along remarkably well, because he had a great teacher. In each trainer's life there always comes a greatness with one certain fighter. For Charlie Goldman, it was Rocky Marciano." Dundee at the time lamented that Marciano based himself at the CYO rather than at Angelo's second home, the legendary Stillman's gym on 326 West and 57th Street. Just as Dundee was to become an institution, so Stillman's had been one for decades. For as New York was the heart of boxing, so Stillman's was its soul. It was here that Goldman felt most at home, here that he forged his fighters, and here that Dundee worked corners with him and watched and learned. Yet never had he so far brought the man who would one day be regarded as his greatest triumph. That is, until Marciano yearned to train on a Monday, the only day that the CYO was closed. Charlie had kept Marciano away from Stillman's through sheer embarrassment. He believed that the fight crowd would disparage his charge, ridicule him for his awkwardness, scoff at his apparent lack of tutelage. But now he realized he had no choice. It was a session that would not be repeated though, for Charlie would continue to steer his boy away from Stillman's until he had broken into the big time and could no longer be hidden away. By then Marciano was no longer the butt of jokes, at least not amongst those who were at the grassroots of boxing and had seen him up close in the ring. Goldman must have felt quietly content that he had managed to evade the unforgiving glare of the boxing gods that day at Stillman's. The Brockton boy had performed okay, and thankfully very few had seen him. Yet the grapevine in the pugilistic world was long entangled. In fact, it extended as far as Los Angeles, where Al Weil was spending his annual 2-week vacation. When he returned, he would confront the diminutive trainer with thunderous spite. There was a train of thought amongst the fight community that the real reason Marciano was kept away from this iconic gymnasium was due not to Goldman's wish to avoid the disparaging comments of his fellow artisans, but rather that Weil was worried that he would lose control of his new potential prospect. It was an open secret that boxing, at that time, was in the vice-like grip of an underworld influence that would not be lifted until the Cavalva hearings almost 2 decades later. And the favourite poaching ground for these predators was Stillman's itself. Here the likes of the notorious Mr. Grey, the underworld czar of boxing, and his various minions would haunt and hustle any clients they thought would be willing to accede to their demands. Most would eventually succumb, for if they did not, all knew that any career in the sport to which they had devoted their lives would be washed away overnight, leaving them hanging hopelessly on the lower tier of the professional ladder, relegated to club fights for meagre crowns and even more meagre purses. Or worse, they may end up like Ray Arcel, the famous fight trainer and bastion of order, with a lead pipe wrapped around their head. It was, in fact, Arcel himself, a man who detested the mob-controlled atmosphere of his beloved game back in the so-called golden years, who in a 1972 interview summed up Weil's fear. Weil, who we all knew was on the take, had been taken for a ride himself by those influencers who ran boxing into the ground back in the 30s and 40s. So he was protective of Marciano in the early days. Not through reasons of charity though. He just wanted to wait until he could use the boy as a bargaining tool, fetch a higher price and have complete control of the situation. Weil was a businessman first, a manager second, so he kept him close in the early years until he had built him into something special, and those influences had no choice but to keep Weil in the loop. But if Weil was mad at Goldman for acting without first consulting him, he was even more irate at his charge for having the temerity of moving out of Mar Braun's without his explicit consent. Yes, even though Weil was not the complete ogre he was believed to be, he still could often be overly exertive as he tried to assert his influence and control over fighters. She was a nice woman, recalled Marciano of Mrs. Rosa Brown, known affectionately as Ma Brown, and her house was clean, but we didn't like it because there was no life there, and it was too far uptown. We didn't have much money, so our only relaxation was walking around. Usually that meant walking around to the CYO, some 75 blocks away. Someone once came up with the foolish suggestion that Rocky should take the bus, but that was ludicrous. Instead it was Roy Kavanagh, one of the truck drivers who would sometimes ferry Colombo to New York whilst Marciano rode with O'Malley, who came up with the perfect compromise. He informed Ali that during his stays in New York he would often find a room at a YMCA over on the corner of West 34th Street and 9th Avenue near Manhattan. The rooms were $1.70 a night with 2 sharing. That was a mere 85 cents a piece. Plus the Y had the added advantages of being central to Weil's office, the CYO, and Broadway. The impressive Madison Square Garden was also but a stone's throw away. Also, and this was the decider, the building was equipped with a gym of its own. Without hesitation the pair moved into this impressive-looking 15-story brick edifice bearing the legend Sloane House, YMCA, in vast, illuminated letters pinioned to his side running vertical down one corner. The William Sloane House, to give it its full grand title, had been opened in 1930 and named after William Sloane, who had, before his death in 1922, being the chair of the Army and Navy International Committee, plus an upstanding member of the National War Work Council of YMCA. The building was intended initially, and in order to honour Sloane's memory, as an inexpensive boarding house for military personnel visiting the metropolitan city. However, as the Second World War ended in 1945, the numbers of servicemen dropped, leaving many of the staggering 1,500 rooms vacant. Thus it was open to the public in general. For a while the building kept itself clean. Visitors would use it for its intended purpose of providing affordable accommodation whilst they stayed and explored, or merely passed through. However, soon an inevitable decline began to set in as more and more it began to metamorphosize into a microcosm of New York itself. The small, cramped rooms would be the hangout of pimps and hookers. Drugs and violence seeped through the long, faceless corridors. Perverts would slice slits into the curtains of the communal showers to peer at those inside. Garbage was tossed out into the pits, a large concrete slab of nowhere land around which the building seemed to be molded. There were rumours that there was more than just trash out there in the growing piles. Bodies too were spoken of, in hushed tones, as being buried within the mess. For sure, murders had already taken place inside the brick belly. Down in the vast L-shaped laundry room, a woman had been killed. Other deaths had occurred. There were some very lonely people there. The city of New York would eventually give up on the former jewel in the YMCA crown in the 1980s. The entire building converted into private apartments during the 90s. The houses of sin never die. They merely evolve. It was into this swiftly rotting carcass that Marciano and Colombo came in November of 1948, and they, Rocky particularly, liked it just fine. So what if it was a dump? So what if the lives lived within were not quite the saintly ones envisaged by those back home? New York's underbelly was a stagnant one. The neon covering that greeted casual visitors and peered out of postcards and tabloid sheets was a charade. All in the city knew it, deep down, but they loved it just the same. For now, at least, the dark ones kept their world to themselves. If you didn't want in, then fine, go your own way with a smile. And Marciano walked through it all with a smile as wide and infectious as his mother's. Others' lives were their own business. Besides, he never spent long in the place. He was always out, either running around Central Park, training at the CYO, eating out in a cafeteria at Columbus Circle, or trawling Broadway with Ali in tow, chatting up the showgirls who were parading on the Mike Todd show as the girls go by, whilst keeping his eye out for the occasional celebrity who may be foolish enough to wander into the street at night. Despite the fact that Marciano liked his new lodgings, there was the problem of becalming Weil, who still wanted Marciano at the boarding house so that he and Charlie could keep an eye on him, make sure he was being looked after and keeping strict to his regime, something that neither fighter and manager needed to worry about. Again, Marciano would assert his independence, thus solidifying the feeling that he was uncomfortable with Weil treating him like an errant child who needed guidance. Marciano explained the problem of travelling between the CYO and his former room. Plus the place was cheaper. Weil calmed down, gave in, and allowed the boys to stay where they were. After his tirade, which seemed to accomplish nothing anyway, Weil informed his fighter that he had a fight lined up for him on the night of November 29th back in Providence. Marciano by this time was no doubt chomping at the bit. This was his longest period of enforced exile since turning pro some 4 months earlier. When he heard the name of his opponent, it is easy to imagine a wry smile creasing his rugged face. for he had history with the man he was set to face. Patrick Connolly, a huge, powerfully built man from out of Boston, yet his ginger hair, which gave him the nickname of Red, belied his Irish Celtic origins. The two fighters had met before in the ring on at least one occasion, whilst Rocky was using the facilities on Russ Murray's estate just outside of Brockton. The self-made magnate thought he would surprise his erstwhile guests with some sparring partners. One of these was Connolly himself. The two fought it out over 3 rounds, and Marciano, as was sometimes his way, looked awful. The bigger, heavier Connolly reportedly forced Rocky all over the ring. "He really embarrassed me," Rocky said later. "All my friends were there and he made me look like a fool. I just hoped that one day I'd get a chance to meet him in the ring, and now he would." Yet the fact that Rocky even managed to climb into the ring at all that night was a minor miracle in itself.
Thank you for listening. Join us again next time as we continue to explore the extraordinary life and career of a remarkable man. Until then, we will see you down the road.
If you like this content, then hit the subscribe button. To really support this channel, consider joining for just over $1 a month and unlock ad-free members-only content. Every member will play a key part in revealing the real Rocky.
I just enjoyed combat. I just enjoyed the sport that I had learned so well, and I had practiced so much that when the bell rang, I did a job. I could concentrate on the opponent. It was a great, great career for me. I'm proud and very happy to talk about it. Sometimes I wonder why I was such an aggressive man in the ring.